It is not allowed.
Okay.
Use the microphone if you would.
Oh, yes, of course. Hi, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the first lecture of the Corner Society. My name is Michal Raz, and together with Mr. Bob Riley, we coordinate the Corner Society, which was founded in 1934 by George Washington Corner, a pioneer in anatomy and embryology, which is also important to remember because it kind of ties with the first topic today. He worked in reproductive endocrinology and set the stage for what would become the oral contraceptive pill. Corner, who trained at Hopkins, arrived at Rochester in 1923, were lured by the dean, Whipple at the time, who we have a postdoc now working on Whipple and his legacy. And he became the first professor of anatomy and the second hire in the school. He worked on changing the curriculum and kind of implementing the Flexner reforms, but he also had an interest in history of medicine. And he began this interest group in the history of medicine in 1934. I think we're the oldest, but I always think we're one of the oldest to kind of be sure nobody's hiding a society somewhere I haven't heard of, but one of the oldest societies in the history of medicine in the nation. We've been meeting regularly since 1934 with a few pauses for international wars and pandemics, but generally we've been pretty consistent. And I'm delighted to welcome you back here. It's the second year I'm coordinating it, and I think we have a really exciting lineup of 7 speakers. At the end, I'll announce the next speaker for October, and I think there'll be lots of topics that are timely and relevant. So that's my welcome to the corner. And today we have a special lecture, and particularly I want to welcome our partners here, the clinicians and from the OBGYN department, and our partners and from the OBGYN. I think it's really fantastic that clinicians find interest in the history. That's really what the society has been envisioned of, a way to kind of bridge divides between history of medicine, humanities, and the medical school and clinical practice. And in particular, I want to thank Dr. Pressman and the OBGYN department for their generous co-sponsorship that enables us to have this event and host our guest. So all this to finally get there to welcome our speaker. Okay, so now I'm absolutely delighted to welcome Dr. Lauren McIver Thompson. She is a historian of early 20th century women's rights, medicine, law, and public health. She's an assistant professor of history and interdisciplinary studies at Kennesaw State University, and is also a faculty fellow at the Georgia State University College of Law's Center for Law, Health, and Society. We met a couple of years ago. We worked on a working group together, kind of talks about law and public policy and health. We kind of became friends without even meeting each other, which is, one of those things that happen in the pandemic. So I'm a big fan of Dr. Thompson's work, which focuses on the intersection of medical authority and expertise, women's health, and public policy in the birth control and reproductive health movement. So she's just finishing up her book, which is titled Rivals and Rights, Mary Dennett, Margaret Sanger, and the Making of the American Birth Control Movement. It's forthcoming with Rutgers University Press, so keep an eye out for that. Apart from being an academic, Dr. Thompson is also a public intellectual and has published essays in places you've probably heard of, like New York Times, Washington Post, and she's quoted regularly in the media as somebody who is a specific knowledge in history of legal aspects of abortion, which I'm sure we can all see why is relevant. Sought after speaker, I'm sure Dr. Thompson wishes her work would be a little less relevant these days. But it's kind of a tragedy to have your work and your historical study be so super relevant. But I'm really, despite that, I'm really thrilled that you're able to come and talk to us here in person, as well as the folks on Zoom. Thank you for joining us from Zoom. We're monitoring the Zoom in the chat room, and we'll be able to also ask questions at the end. So all this to welcome Dr. Thompson. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everybody. I'm going to make sure everybody can hear me. Thank you all for having me here today and for that very generous introduction. And thank you to the staff who helped coordinate here. And it's really a pleasure to be with you all, and it's an honor to be asked to deliver the corner lecture. So hopefully we'll be able to kind of unpack today some of the things that we're seeing in the news regarding abortion and birth control. So we're going to be talking about, obviously, a very timely topic. the role of physicians, the law, and reform on the topics of birth control and abortion. And so this work is, let's see if this will advance. Does not want to go. It did before. Let me try this. Hold on, I'm going to use the mouse. Let's do that. There we go. Okay. The work is part of my larger book project titled Rivals and Rights, Mary Dennett, Margaret Sanger, in the making of the American birth control movement, under contract with Rutgers University Press and hopefully out in 2024. So I wanted to say too at the outset that I myself am the product of 4 generations of physicians, 2 generations of OBGYNs in particular. So this is a topic that really grew out of my own kind of upbringing and initial interest in medicine. I became very, very interested in the relationships between reformers, doctors, and legislators in terms of birth control and abortion law. So my book examines the rivalry between these 2 key reformers that you see on the screen here, Mary Ware Dennett, who's pictured on the left, and Margaret Sanger, who is pictured on the right. And these 2 women emerged as bitter adversaries and who had sharply competing ideals about the role of contraception in society. And they approached it from 2 angles, one from the perspective of medicine, and the other from the perspective of free speech and civil rights. So as my book shows, examining the conflicting agendas of Dennett and Sanger together reveal a new angle on the history of birth control in the United States and its place within the early 20th century women's movement. In 1915, it was actually Dennett who founded the first birth control organization in the United States. It predated Margaret Sanger's American Birth Control League by 6 years. And unlike Sanger, Dennett was a suffragist, and she also fundamentally rejected the relationship between eugenics and birth control that would become synonymous with Sanger. Instead, she was the one who sought to legalize birth control via the rights of free speech and free expression. And it was Dennett's approach to birth control reform, I argue, that pushed Sanger in new directions and sort of forced the movement as a whole toward strategies that continue to profoundly affect today's reproductive law and policy. So the project attempts to reinterpret standard histories of birth control and relatedly abortion in the United States, and it challenges the general understanding that Margaret Sanger was the sole leader of the movement. And further, as they worked to bring birth control into the mainstream, Dennett and Sanger's politics, their feminism, their attitudes about medicine and eugenics and race, and their approaches to reform would forever shape and cement the way that we understand reproductive control in American society. So, see, I'm still getting used to how to do the slide here. Okay, there we go. You can probably imagine then, for those of us who write about the histories of birth control and abortion, what May 2nd, 2022 was like. That was the day that the Dobbs decision was first leaked to the media. And while the leak was a surprise, the content was not. And of course, there are many people, not just historians, who had been expecting the fall of Roe v. Wade for a long time. But watching the fall of legalized abortion in real time, and similarly, the looming threat to contraception, was like watching our research and our understanding of the historical trajectories that shaped birth control and abortion law somehow come full circle. It certainly reiterated for me the fact that progress is not a linear march forward in US history, but rather a series of starts and stops, retreats and advances. And although one continues to hope that one day we can maybe move past that, I really don't think that we can overemphasize just how true that paradigm is for women in the United States, particularly women of color. Scholars of women's history know all too well that the story of women in the United States is one of incomplete gains and outright revocations over more than 3 centuries. So we are now living through a moment of outright revocation of a pre-existing right, and there are questions about what might come next. So as a scholar of contraceptive history, I have some guesses. So indeed, it quickly, very, very quickly became clear that to those watching the news that birth control and abortion are not separate histories and they remain linked social issues. You simply cannot have one without the other. In fact, in early America, indeed all over the world, abortion, especially in the first trimester, was birth control. Part of this stemmed from the fact that not getting your period was seen as a problem to be treated. I don't have to tell a room full of doctors about humoral theory, but nevertheless, humoral theory, the ancient belief that the body continually produced blood, bile, phlegm, and other substances, which all had to be in balance to maintain health. So if you were sick or if your period wasn't coming, it was viewed as being caused by some kind of blockage that needed to be removed. And it was not until the 1920s, as Dennett and Sanger start battling for primacy in the movement, that they begin to explicitly argue that abortion would be eliminated if birth control were made legal. So in today's talk, then, I'm going to discuss the nuance of this argument and their understanding of the place of abortion in American society. And I'm going to illustrate how the gradual medicalization of birth control and the professionalization of physicians alongside the court system increasingly was willing to recognize and elevate that authority, and how that would all shape birth control and abortion access for the rest of the 20th century. So to get at these larger themes, I'm going to cover three central events in the history of the American birth control movement that form the core of a few different chapters of my book. So the first is Dennett's unsuccessful fight with the New York Academy of Medicine beginning in 1920 to get doctors in that organization to support birth control. But even as physicians' reluctance stymied the movement, by the mid-1930s, the birth control reform movement had become firmly connected to medical expertise. And two other examples, I argue, shed light on that shift. First, there's a 1936 federal court case that freed doctors from legal consequences in prescribing contraception. And there was a public birth control in North Carolina, the first one of its kind, conceptualized and run by one doctor in particular. And as we will then take a look at, by the time the Supreme Court heard the case Griswold v. Connecticut in 1965, which is the case that legalized birth control in advance of Roe v. Wade, the right of physicians to manage reproduction was already cemented. So the Roe v. Wade case looked at Griswold and its rulings on physicians and privacy and birth control to make a similar pronouncement about abortion. So the links between birth control, abortion, and medical practice are really key to understanding how the Dobbs decision, far from being unprecedented, instead reflects well over a century of developments in the realm of reproductive law and medicine. All right, so the first thing I'll say about all of this is none of this was foreordained. It was not predestined that birth control or even abortion, even surgical methods of abortion, would become the domain of physicians or even regulated by law. It was not even, because both of those things happened, we have to understand why. We need to look at both the place of contraception and abortion in the 18th and 19th centuries, and also the trajectory of American medical development. So birth control advice and devices have long been available since the colonial period. Many of you may have heard through the media that Benjamin Franklin even included a recipe for an abortifacient in one of his advice books from the Revolutionary era, where there were other books that detailed how to restore the menses, like William Buchan's Domestic Medicine, which is pictured here. Many Americans would have had this on their bookshelf in the late 1700s, early 1800s. And of course, enslaved women and Native women had extensive knowledge of birth control, and that knowledge spread amongst women of all races. So by the 19th century, information continued to freely circulate in manuals like Robert Dale Owen's Moral Physiology, published in 1831, or Dr. Edward Bliss Foote's Medical Common Sense, published in 1864. And all of that kind of freely circulating knowledge reminds us that trained physicians in medical schools and hospitals were not common until later in the 19th century. Americans handled their health at home via midwives, healers, self-administered medicines and treatments, with women often serving as the family physician. And women treating themselves was an absolute necessity, because in a world without the medical technologies and advances that we have now, women constantly suffered from a variety of reproductive and childbirth related problems, including lacerations, tears in the vaginal wall or uterus, vesicovaginal fistulas, diastasis recti, and other issues that plagued women with irritation, incontinence, pain, and even lifelong debility. Treatments for uterine or vaginal problems like infections, prolapsed or tilted uteri, dysmenorrhea, fibroids, and a myriad of other issues included washes, administered by syringe, plus pills, tampons, douches, sponges, pessaries, and suppositories, all of which were sold by druggists, were mail order, and they were designed for women to be able to use at home. And they were advertised in newspapers and magazines with euphemisms like mother's friend, remedy for irregularity, uterine regulator, or relief for ladies, all of these different things. And again, they're available everywhere, mail order catalogs, local druggists, traveling salesmen. Instruments were also widely available in these catalogs, and that included douching tubing, uterine dilators, and probes. And again, much of that would have been designed to induce menstruation. These methods were thus what we call emmenagogues, or substances designed to stimulate menstrual flow. And of course, some of these items were also simultaneously used for reproductive control, although their efficacy was mixed, right? Pessaries, although designed for uterine issues, could, with the right design, function like a diaphragm or cervical cap. And designers and manufacturers began to create rubber devices that they started to refer to as womb guards or preventative pessaries, among other names. Sponges were also very popular, and they were sold alongside spermicidal washes made with astringents and common household substances like vinegar and baking soda. They also often contained herbs and plants that have been long associated with abortion, including things like savin, black cohosh, aloe, cotton root, tansy, ergot, rue. Although both women and physicians consider delayed menstruation to be a serious health issue requiring action, the abortifacient qualities of these things were also well known and implied in their advertising. So all of these items had a dual medical as well as contraceptive or abortifacient use. And despite that, their advertising and sale were a very common feature of life in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And even if we jump forward to the 1920s and 1930s, companies like Lysol and Zonite they carry on that tradition. They begin to market their products, which contain Cresol, as feminine hygiene, which became code for contraception. So Margaret Sanger, for example, included a Lysol douche in her pamphlet Family Limitation, which was a little book that got her arrested and landed her in Blackwell Island Prison in New York. Surgical abortion also gained popularity in the 1840s as well. So a layperson who was well-versed in using instruments to puncture the uterus and remove the fetus could set up a business doing this. They used specialized perforating and forceps-like instruments, which included cranioclasts, trepans, and basiotribes, such as the one pictured in the corner. These instruments basically reduced the cranial circumference in order to quickly remove the fetal body with the least possible trauma to the woman's body, because there were no antibiotics or transfusions, so speed would have been of the essence. One of the most famous surgical abortionists is pictured here, and her nickname was Madame Restel. Her real name was probably Anne Troe-Lohman, we think. She called herself Madame Restel, and she ran a thriving business in New York for over 3 decades, and she had satellite offices in Boston and Philadelphia. Female abortionists like Madame Restel often referred to themselves or were referred to as female physicians. Restel apparently taught herself how to do abortions by probing the women's uteruses with a piece of whalebone. And most likely that meant that she probably inserted the whalebone into a woman's cervical opening, and she compromised the cervical plug and caused the uterus to contract and expel the fetus. And she openly advertised her services in newspapers to, quote, married ladies whose delicate or precarious health forbids a too rapid increase in family. So Restel and others who performed abortions or sold birth control and abortifacient items, nevertheless, were risking the law's consequences. Under Justice Alito's suggestion in the Dobbs case that abortion was always a crime in America, we actually know that that's an incorrect statement that he made. The first laws governing contraception and abortion were passed in Connecticut in 1821, and then just shortly thereafter in New York. And they were not aimed at morality, however. Rather, they were aimed at the risk of poisoning. because after all, they were part of this universe of patent medicines in general, which were unregulated and marketed with abandon. So you could order a headache medicine, for example, that might also do bad things to you. Didn't have to be an abortive fashion or a contraceptive device. All of these unregulated pharmaceuticals were just being sold all the time, everywhere in these mail order catalogs and in every store on the corner. And further, I want to point out too that the laws that initially were passed in the 1820s and 1830s did not criminalize abortion before quickening whatsoever. The law recognized that a woman had a basic right to bodily integrity until somewhere between the 4th and 6th month of pregnancy. So by the middle of the 19th century, however, doctors began to urge legislators throughout the United States to criminalize abortion and contraceptives. So these were physicians like Horatio Storer and Joseph Tabor Johnson and other members of the American Medical Association, which was formed in 1847. And they were seeking to consolidate their authority in a world where they were really competing openly with midwives, healers, homeopaths, who they termed the irregulars. And abortion was the issue that doctors could use to differentiate themselves as the regulars, who were purposefully and openly aligning themselves with the state and the law in order to elevate their status and become kind of the arbiters of national health and morality. So anti-choice reformers today have often claimed that the physicians who helped pass these laws in the 19th century were doing this out of a serious commitment to fetal life. And we see that argument echoed in the Dobbs decision by Justice Alito, who assumes that that was what was driving anti-abortion laws in the past. And it is true that we do see some arguments from physicians like Storer, where he refers to abortion as murder, but he also lends equal weight to his outrage over women participating in the suffrage movement, refusing to fulfill the duties of mother and wifehood, and crucially to the idea that too many white middle-class women were getting abortions and allowing non-white people to, quote, overrun the race. That's using his words. So the eugenic origins of abortion laws were really the key force in criminalizing abortion, followed closely by misogyny and concern for immoral women and being able to have consequence-free sex like men. Publicly, at least, most doctors denounced birth control and abortion in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. They claimed that women who were artificially limiting the number of children they had were violating, quote, the ethics of marriage, the laws of nature. They were endangering the very foundation of the state, the home. All of this is coming from the Journal of the American Medical Association in the late 19th century. So it's no surprise then that by 1900, every state in the Union had criminalized abortion in some form or fashion. But because they were often based on model law written by doctors themselves in those states, often state medical societies would get involved in the writing of those laws. The statutes contained exceptions for physicians who stated a need for a therapeutic abortion for their patients. And I should note that this really put the burden of proving medical need for an abortion on doctors, and many were risking their reputations and licenses to help patients obtain them in this period. Meanwhile, on the federal level, abortion and birth control also become criminalized. So this is just a from top to bottom situation here, not because of medical pressure, but because of an obsession with obscenity. So Vice Reformer Anthony Comstock, who is pictured here in all his mustached glory, established his New York Society for the Suppression of Vice, the NYSSV, in 1872. And in a legal triumph against constitutional free speech, he persuades Congress to pass what became known as the Comstock Postal Act, and the law banned the mailing of obscene, lewd, lascivious, or filthy material through the US Postal Service. But it did not explicitly define what constituted obscenity. So that meant that judicial interpretations of what constituted obscenity were all over the place. They were dispensed with wide latitude and covered basically anything dealing with in any way with sex, marriage, abortion, birth control, you name it. And various state bills also followed suit. So not only did states have criminal abortion laws, but then they also had mini Comstock laws, and all of those things were governing contraception and this legal regime of contraception and abortion access. And it was quite serious to violate the Comstock law. First-time offenders were punished with a then enormous sum of $5,000 and 5 years in prison. And he sent many, many people to prison. Both Dennett and Sanger actually would become targets of Comstock's zealous pursuit of obscenity and filth, both enduring trials and for Sanger, even jail time. And the cartoon pictured here from Life magazine kind of says it all. It represents his campaigns. The artist is being arrested by Comstock for painting a presumably nude woman, even though you can't see anything. And the caption says, "Don't you suppose I can imagine what's under the water?" So that's why he's getting arrested. So it's important to remember, though, that, and I want to be very clear about this, that Comstock's campaign was not just about abortion. It was about pornography and sexual material as much as it was about abortion or birth control. So that's a really crucial distinction that tells us that abortion did not carry the disproportionate weight in thinking about what constituted a crime of obscenity in that period, despite what the Dobbs case frames it as. Nevertheless, because of the messy patchwork of abortion laws at both the federal and state level, what this did mean is that abortion was policed irregularly and resulted in frequently conflicting local court decisions. Further, we know that women continued to seek them out for unwanted pregnancies, and research really suggests that they sought abortions at consistent rates both before and after the passage of these state and federal statutes. As scientific medicine gradually gained a foothold in American society, more women did seek abortions from licensed practitioners, even though the practice was still illegal. But the most desperate, those who could not afford access to a clinician, qualified or otherwise, or just could not afford it, period, they performed self-induced abortions. They used sharp objects such as knitting needles, hairpins, crochet hooks, pencils, catheters, even Clorox and turpentine. And not surprisingly, they suffered very extreme complications, such as perforations of the uterus and septic infection, which was often fatal. And it's really difficult to know how many women died in this period from abortions gone wrong. And we have some statistics from the 1930s because there was a physician named Dr. Frederick Taussig, who wrote a book called Abortion, Spontaneous and Induced, Medical and Social Aspects in 1936. And he estimated that there were probably somewhere around 681,000 abortions per year, illegal abortions per year, based on his census calculations. And then he calculated from that probably somewhere between 8,000 and 10,000 women a year were dying in that grouping. But he acknowledged that by the 1930s, methods, of course, in terms of hygiene and safety had gotten better. And so the number would have been lower in the 30s than it would have been in prior decades. So all that is to say that by the early 20th century, most physicians were starting to chafe at the harsh laws because even with these life and health exceptions that were contained in the state statutes, it made them subject to a level of legal scrutiny that they argued prevented them from really practicing their profession as they saw fit. And although it has been charged as a, quote, bad decision, even from abortion supporters, Roe v. Wade, if you look at it, merely returned the decision-making to medicine regarding abortion and reflected this like pre-19th century acceptance of abortion before quickening. And it really also echoed the longstanding legal acceptance of physicians being able to prescribe birth control for their patients, even though birth control was also criminalized for the general public. So since 1936, thanks to a case called United States versus One Package of Japanese Pastries, courts had decided that physicians' professional rights embrace the right to prescribe contraceptive devices for medical reasons. And the decision contributed to an increase in the establishment of birth control clinics across the United States beginning in the early 1940s, and it expanded contraceptive access for some patients. By the time Justice Blackmun authored the opinion in Roe, doctors had been freed for nearly 40 years to preside over the health and the morality of their patients. So legalizing contraception seemed to be the end solution to solve the abortion problem. This is where Dennett and Sanger's stories begin to emerge in terms of their involvement with the movement and also their swiftly fracturing relationship with each other. Sorry, I'm not very good at this mouse. Hold on. It does not want to show up on, oh, there we go. Okay, there we go. Okay, so first I'm going to talk very briefly about Margaret Sanger and who she was so we can sort of compare her against Mary Ware Dennett. She was born in 1879, one of 11 children. She was educated at both Catholic and private boarding schools, and she eventually turned toward nursing training and graduated from the White Plains Hospital program outside New York City. She was married in 1902 to William Sanger, who was an architect. She raised 3 young children, and they entertained some of the sort of leading socialist luminaries of the day at their home. She joined the Industrial Workers of the World as a strike organizer, and it was at that point that she began teaching herself contraceptive techniques, because at that time nursing school offered no training in contraceptives. But in the socialist movement, ideas about birth control and family limitation were increasingly discussed, and women who supported labor rights and socialist ideals began to agitate for more sexual freedom in society. So even as mainstream socialists were hesitant to lend their support, these socialist women argued that without birth control, free childcare, support for families, the working class would never be successful in improving social conditions. So Sanger picked up this language. She advocated for women's first freedom as the right to control her own body. She repeatedly stated that birth control was the solution to abortion, and that she also said abortion was immoral. She wrote in her pamphlet, Family Limitation, any attempt to interfere with the development of the fertilized ovum is called an abortion. No one can doubt that there are times when an abortion is justifiable, that they will become unnecessary when care is taken to prevent conception. This is the only cure for abortions. Nevertheless, her advocacy drew the ire of Comstock-approved post office officials. She evaded arrest by traveling to Europe, where she visited physician experts and various birth control clinics before returning to New York in 1916. And it was at that time that she opened up a birth control clinic in Brownsville, which is pictured on the sort of top left there, located in Brooklyn, where mostly Jewish and Italian immigrant families lived. On the first day, the clinic served more than 100 women. She was arrested numerous times for operating the clinic, and she stood trial in January of 1917. She landed in prison for 30 days for operating this clinic. And in 1921, she would go on to found the American Birth Control League to further her goals around birth control. But by the mid-1920s, she kind of turns away from that socialist feminist outlook, and she begins to tone down some of her more overtly radical tactics in favor of wooing expert physicians who were not necessarily interested in hearing her socialist feminist arguments. So she lobbied for what was popularly called the Doctors Only Bill. So rather than lobbying Congress to outright repeal the provision in the Comstock Act making birth control illegal, she and the American Birth Control League drew up proposed legislation that amended the law not to allow free distribution of birth control, but to allow only physicians to prescribe it. So this Doctors Only Bill firmly aligned birth control not with obscenity, but with the benefits of better public health and medical expertise. So physicians who supported birth control insisted on being involved in this and helping to control the dissemination of it. So there were physicians like Robert L. Dickinson, who was a pioneer of sterilization surgery and head of New York's Committee on Maternal Health. And he explained it this way. He said, the work of birth control was constructive, but physicians should strive to collaborate with church and school and college in exalting marriage and monogamy. Instead of sidestepping, we will share and we will lead. So he aimed to convince medical doctors that they should maintain ultimate control of contraceptive devices and information, and that would strengthen heterosexual marriage and ultimately the state itself. Sanger grounded her legal and moral position about medicalizing birth control in the idea that an open market for contraception, such as the one that existed for the vast majority of the 18th and 19th and early 20th centuries, would hurt women. It would leave them at the mercy of unscrupulous contraceptive distributors whose products were ineffective or dangerous. And as she later explained, no one had sufficient knowledge of the possible consequences of some contraceptives to permit them to be manufactured or distributed without guidance or direction. They might kill the birth control movement as well as some of the women who use them. So I want to highlight here that although historians and of course the public tend to view her as an activist, Sanger was, as I mentioned, a trained nurse. And so given this debate that I'm discussing today, I want to suggest that we should really view her as part of medicine and the medical establishment and not separate from it. So this reconsideration of Sanger, I think, helps to really help us to better understand the core of her debate with Dennett and its consequences. And of course, Sanger's position is the one that has endured until today. Now birth control is considered a crucial part of formal reproductive medicine obtained through a physician prescription. But as we know, the development of the birth control pill, IUDs, and other hormonal treatments for controlling reproduction have often very problematic stories in the larger narrative of the history of women's health and minority health in the United States. For example, the racist and colonialist history of running the first birth control trials in Puerto Rico, the protest in the 1960s and 1970s by the feminist women's health movement against patriarchal medicine, and the related congressional pill hearings in 1970, to name just a few examples. And all of those speak to the complicated history of the collision between race, gender, medicine, and public health in the late 20th century. And we can trace a lot of that backstory, argue, to the medical and legal politics of the birth control movement in the 20s and the process by which it became part of the medical establishment. And that history becomes really especially salient when we look at how in the early days of the movement, it seemed possible for a moment that contraception would not be viewed through a medicalized lens necessarily, but a civil liberties lens. And it was Mary Ware Dennett, pictured here, who advocated for this approach. Her emphasis on framing birth control as free speech was certainly in keeping with a general expansion in American civil liberties in this period, and I can talk more about that in the Q&A. But decoupling birth control from radicalism and connecting it to medical expertise would be the key to its success in the coming decades. But she was wary of the consequences of that change. She argued that physician control of contraception constituted a medical monopoly, where paternalistic physicians would have the sole power to decide who deserved birth control and who didn't. So she advocated that approaching birth control legalization as a right of free speech and free information instead would foster an open market wherein individuals and families could privately decide what was best without government or even medical interference. And her approach kind of offers us this interesting what if in understanding the framings around our current reproductive politics. And also her own experiences around abortion and birth control reinforced her ideas. For example, her sister Clara had an abortion at a New York hospital when she was unable to face having any more children. And Dennett wrote of visiting her sister to cheer her up. And she repeated also similar arguments to Sanger about contraception being the ultimate solution to eliminating abortion. And after all, Dennett herself knew what it was like to have unwanted pregnancies and the consequences of them. She ended up having 3 children total, but only 2 survived. And it was the birth of her last son, Devin, that left her ill for 2 years with an internal vaginal tear that would eventually require surgery. And throughout her pregnancies and after Devin's birth, physicians told Dennett to avoid sexual activity completely, but as usual for that era, did not give any contraceptive advice. And she would later write to her friend and fellow birth control advocate, Mary Stopes, "I was utterly ignorant of the control of conception, as was my husband also. We had never had anything like normal relations, having approximated almost complete abstinence in the endeavor to space our babies, both wanted but both accidental." So Dennett would later implicate the lack of legal and available contraceptive knowledge for both her own illness and her ensuing marital troubles, because after her last son's birth, her husband decided to have an affair with one of his, he was also an architect, just like Sanger's husband, and he had a sort of unrepentant romantic interest in one of his female, the wife of one of his clients, and that would ultimately tear the couple apart. Their 1913 divorce would be laid bare in the newspapers with every mortifying detail recounted, and these experiences really left Dennett with little patience for male chauvinism, either in husbands or in doctors. And as her marriage disintegrated, she relocated to New York City with her sons. She threw herself into suffrage reform. She served as the literature coordinator for the National American Women's Suffrage Association until 1915. And she also was interested in socialist ideals, which at their core promoted the idea that women would be more fully emancipated in a more just and equitable world. And it was she kind of mixed in some radical circles. And actually it was in one of those kind of meetings that she also met Margaret Sanger. She also heard Emma Goldman speak, who was another kind of famous birth control reformer. And these, when she was in New York, kind of hearing all of these ideas, it began to percolate in her mind that she too might be interested in birth control reform. So on March 31st, 1915, There we go. Oh, there's the divorce slide. I'm sorry, I missed a slide. You can see how this was very embarrassing for her. Anyway, she founded the what was called the Voluntary Parenthood League. And again, this is the first birth control organization in the United States. And she founded this with two friends from the suffrage movement. Originally, it was called the National Birth Control League, and they transformed it to the VPL. And they insisted that doctors had a responsibility to their patients to give them proper contraceptive information based on science, and that only the law prevented them from doing so. It emphasized that parents should be the ones to decide whether to use birth control without interference. And an early league pamphlet said, "We believe that the question as to whether or not and when a woman should have a child is not a question for physicians to decide, except when the woman's life is endangered, but a question for the individual family to decide." And so her organization also alleged that enlightened, rational, expert doctors championed birth control, and only the poor, poorly educated, badly skilled doctors did not. So, as I discuss in my book, she decides to go down to the New York Academy of Medicine, and this is several years after the founding of the VPL. And her worst fears about the medical establishment were kind of realized during these meetings, because this is in between 1920 and 21. She attempts to court the doctors in the NYAM for a support of a straight repeal of birth control from the Comstock Act. So she basically wants their support to help her go lobby in Congress. And Dennett knew that there was little chance that she could make any legal headway without the support of physicians. And then she wasn't stupid. She figured that she really needed these guys to endorse her. So she attends a meeting of the Academy's Public Health Committee, where she had a 15-minute hearing to explain her case. 5 of those minutes were absorbed by the committee chairman's railing against the cause of birth control. Dennett pressed on, however. She ended up sending literature afterward to committee members, but by April 6th, a subcommittee consisting of 5 physicians had countered with their own suggestion for amending the Comstock law, writing to the VPL that they did not approve of the amendment as written, and they would only recommend a set of phrases that would amend the law to say that, quote, "nothing in the obscenity law shall apply to duly licensed physicians in connection with their discharge of their respective duties and protecting the health of patients and of the community." In other words, birth control was to remain obscene for everyone else except doctors, just as Sanger had been advocating. So Dennett tries to get the larger committee to reconsider. She writes to them these very nice notes saying, "I totally understand your position, but," she argues that basically if at first we just remove birth control from the obscenity clause, like that's the first step, like don't worry, nobody's trying to take power away from the doctors, but this is the first legal step that we need to take. And she argued that the doctor's bill actually would continue to associate birth control with indecent sex, rather than a practicality, a necessity thing, a thing that people just used daily in their daily lives. So throughout the summer of 1920, she continues to work to earn their support. She even began planning a conference at New York's Colony Club. She invited 17 physicians to attend. Yet her correspondence with the Academy physicians reveals an increasingly intractable disagreement. Some of the doctors write to her and say, "Please take me off your mailing list. I never consented to be to this conversation." They accused her of using their names without permission, which she vehemently denied. And memos circulated among NYAM members that the statements of the Voluntary Parenthood League were inaccurate, misleading, or false, and they warned that physicians had a moral duty to prevent regular people from obtaining contraception for reasons unrelated to health. So by January of 1921, Dennett just gives up. She sends out a report to the VPL, and she calls these events an uncomfortable episode. She states that the physicians had basically totally misinterpreted what she was trying to do. They were reading into my statements ideas that were not there. So her unsuccessful fight with the Academy in 1920 to 21 illustrates the first step in how medical power and professionalization came to control birth control's narrative strategy in the coming years. Indeed, Margaret Sanger, who openly supported physicians like the ones in the New York Academy of Medicine and their insistence on a doctor's only bill, took control of the movement by aligning it not only with medicine, but also the science of eugenics. And so eugenics emerges in the 1870s as a scientific theory related to Darwinism and natural selection, and it posits that humans like animals, could be bred for better health. By the early 20th century, it was a science that was taken very seriously at research centers all over the country, universities, by important leaders. It developed into a very highly organized movement. It was taught in biology classrooms. It seemed to justify everything from generally improving health and environmental conditions all the way up to, as you know, sterilization and even euthanasia of the disabled and the unfit. So the ABCL and Sanger's magazine, the Birth Control Review, published monthly essays on legalizing contraception in order to control the birth of the unfit, and they featured guest essays on sterilization and eugenic law. So while interested in eugenics, Dennett, unlike Sanger, was very, very wary of linking birth control and eugenic thinking. And she told one correspondent that these two issues are entirely separate. They should not be jumbled together. They're two quite different considerations. They are far from synonymous. She advised another correspondent who asked her to review a manuscript on eugenics to remove his arguments about the control of the unfit as if it were a simple birth control problem, when they actually have to do with sterilization and segregation and various forms of governmental functioning by which the freedom of the individual is curtailed for the good of society. So when she wrote that letter in 1928, Dennett was still lobbying Congress for repeal of the Comstock law. She was not setting up clinics like Sanger. She was not wooing eugenicists like Sanger. Meanwhile, Sanger, though, had been successful in establishing clinics and transforming the movement to focus on kind of contraceptive research. So I do want to pause here, though, and say it's important to note that Sanger's embrace of eugenic thinking, it was neither Sanger's embrace of eugenic thinking nor the proliferation of new and shiny birth control clinics that would be the key to convincing physicians and eugenic experts that birth control should be legal. First, eugenics and birth control were not synonymous, despite Sanger's efforts in the 1920s and 1930s. The eugenics movement had the backing of universities, scientific agendas. It was part of a national conversation about the health and future of American power and national superiority. Birth control, by contrast, was still publicly controversial. It smacked of sex and immorality, and few eugenicists wanted to claim Sanger as one of their own. But by being connected with eugenics, birth control stood to gain legitimacy, while being connected with birth control threatened the prestige of the eugenics movement. As for clinics, it is true that clinics certainly did much of the hard work of distributing birth control on the ground, especially to low-income women, fitting them for pessaries or diaphragms, or providing low-cost solutions that didn't require a pelvic exam, such as spermicidal foams or jellies. And though raids on birth control clinics happened, since they distributed the information in person as opposed to the mails, that meant that they were not necessarily going to be the target of the Comstock laws. And they could run relatively freely for the most part, although not always. Nevertheless, many physicians and the American public viewed these clinics as suspect. Accusations were rife that they were run by lay people who knew nothing about medicine, or at best incompetent doctors who couldn't otherwise succeed in private practice. That was also the intimation. To many, clinics were quite simply places where promiscuous women could illicitly seek techniques to have sex without any consequences, like men. There were even accusations that these clinics were merely a front for providing illegal abortions, although clinic records suggest that that was extremely rare, and when it did happen, it was for therapeutic reasons. Private physicians really did not hide their disdain for clinics, many of which were independently run. The New York Academy of Medicine's Committee on Public Health Relations recommended in a report that it was not clinics, but professional physicians who should be the ones to assume leadership in the recognition of medically indicated contraception. So how did that come about? We have to look back at this one court case, federal court case, and I say that birth control reform really made the most national and legal headway when physicians, touting their need to exercise their professional expertise without fear of legal consequences, when that gets codified in the law, that's when things really grow. Their cause gains a really big boost in 1936 when this fabulously named case, the United States versus one package of Japanese pessaries, was heard in a US district court. This was a test case. It was a test of the constitutionality of the 1873 Comstock Act, as well as the more recent 1930 Tariff Act, both of which banned the importation, sale, or distribution of contraceptive information and devices. Sanger and her civil liberties attorney, Morris Ernst, who's pictured there, He had also defended her during her clinic arrests, 20 years earlier. They realized that in order to garner the medical profession's official endorsement of birth control, like they were seeking the official endorsement of the American Medical Association, really, they would really have to work to remove its association with obscenity and immorality and really connect it in the law to medical expertise. So the court case, this court case is the one that hastens that transformation. And on December 7th of 1936, Judge August Hand upheld the decision of the lower court that had heard the one package case, arguing that the Comstock Act's design was not to prevent the full medical practice of, quote, conscientious and competent physicians. And Ernst later noted that the opinion made no restrictions on the circumstances in which a doctor was free to prescribe a contraceptive. So the inference was clear that the medical profession was to be the sole judge of the propriety of a prescription in a given case, and the legality of his action was not to be questioned. So the one package decision appeared to be this total victory for Sanger and her supporters. They trumpeted it as the law of the land. The birth control review noted, spread the word to physicians, nurses, hospitals, social workers, mothers in your community. A new era of Planned Parenthood has begun. And indeed, 1 year later, the American Medical Association, which had been very long reticent in officially endorsing birth control, took to heart Ernst's insistence that the one package case was nothing less than the, quote, medical profession's Bill of Rights in the field of contraceptive medicine. And they endorsed a variety of measures surrounding physicians' legal rights to prescribe contraceptives. Significantly, they called for medical school education to include a thorough review of contraceptive instruction and to investigate new materials, devices, and methods for the prevention of conception. So we know a lot about how this played out in terms of doctors' private practice, because in the wake of the one package decision, we know that doctors were more freely prescribing contraceptives. And we know this because of some data that was collected about 10 years later by Dr. Alan Guttmacher, who is pictured here. And while at Johns Hopkins University, he conducted a national study in 1947 of 15,000 physicians, including all the licensed practicing OBGYNs in the US. And of the some 3,300 returned and completed surveys, Guttmacher's study found that 68% of physicians approved of contraceptive advice being given to any married woman who requested it, and that fewer than 2.5 disapproved of contraception regardless of cause. 51% of the respondents reported prescribing contraceptives frequently, and another 32% occasionally. So the one package decision helped to medicalize contraception. It was done under the auspices of Sanger and other reformers' consistent efforts to hammer away at the Comstock laws, not via legislative change or from the perspective of free speech, as Dennett had been advocating, but from the angle of medical expertise. It also illustrates that doctors had largely accepted contraception into their medical practice, and they were working with patients who wanted to use it. Patients' access to birth control expanded rapidly in many cases, but not always. And so this brings me back to my final example. One public birth control program established in North Carolina in 1938 illustrates an exception to that, and it shows how the forces of racial discrimination, paternalism, and medicine came to operate in the movement. It speaks to Dennett's fears of what would happen if and when physician paternalism and race-based and eugenic thought were birth control's primary motivators. So Dr. Clarence Gamble, who's pictured here, heir to the Procter & Gamble fortune and a Harvard Medical School graduate, established the North Carolina program. And in this case, the program was almost entirely developed and run by him on his own. He was a firm eugenicist. He believed that sterilization and applying contraceptive programming in undesirable populations was the key to, quote, improving the race. So in 1937, he worked with North Carolina health officials to personally fund and administer for an entire year the distribution and testing of a foam powder contraceptive that he had personally developed. He argued it could be distributed cheaply and easily, and ironically, he touted that it actually didn't need to be distributed by or dispensed by physicians at all, not even necessarily requiring a clinic visit, although setting up local clinics was also part of the program. And he was especially proud of the impact his program could have on the state's poor Black population, encouraging them to have fewer babies. He noted, decrease in population is not a thing to be worried about, but decrease in the more intelligent levels of the population it is. And it is my belief that contraception as a public health measure will tend to correct the present unfortunate differential birth rate. He and others also believed that Black people could only use the simplest contraceptives because they lacked the intelligence or interest to seek out birth control, and that it must be administered to them in the clearest and most directive way possible. But of course, as we know, that wasn't true, and moreover, the foam powder did not work. Both clinic field workers and patients protested once its inefficacy became clear. Further, Gamble, as planned, withdrew his funding in 1940 from the program, and contraceptive distribution and clinic operation continued on a county by county basis, depending on local officials. And these are some of his notes that are contained in the Countway Library. The back of that photograph found in his papers indicates a family living in Wake County, North Carolina, 15 children, 12 living, 3 dead, 2-room shack, welfare case. The existence of this program illustrates how much had changed since Dennett had battled the physicians of the New York Academy of Medicine almost 20 years earlier. Physicians had successfully put birth control in the domain of medicine. In general, men dominated birth control reform by this point, to the point where women who had started the movement were deliberately being excluded from new initiatives, except as lower level functionaries or nurses. Indeed, Dr. George Cooper, who was the state director of this program, was explicit that it had nothing to do with Margaret Sanger. He explained, quote, "She didn't have a dad blamed thing to do with it, and we don't want any part of Margaret Sanger's advertising and controversy." At the national level, men were being hired to head birth control organizations, and only male physicians were usually the ones considered to run the medical director positions. The North Carolina program was also a harbinger of the future trajectory of birth control programming in the 1940s and 1950s, especially among communities of color. Within a few years, the ABCL, now renamed Planned Parenthood, launched a contraceptive campaign titled Better Health for 13 Million, aimed at African Americans. But patients who were supposed to be the beneficiaries of the program were at the mercy of white reformers and physicians who basically repeatedly changed their minds about these services. They terminated financial support frequently and often without any reason. And although Black doctors and health professionals sought to help lead the program, often white leaders at Planned Parenthood and white physicians simply just did not invest the appropriate resources into making it a truly biracial coalition. Although they were better than other organizations, including the still segregated American Medical Association. And Black patients, while certainly not uninterested in birth control, rightly distrusted a white-led medical establishment where they encountered racist and paternalist attitudes. So some Black suffragists like Angela Grimke Weld worked with Margaret Sanger to publicize birth control methods in the Black community. There were mass meetings at Black churches, political clubs. Black newspaper editors wrote editorials supporting birth control. They claimed, or they argued that it would be a huge improvement in Black women's lives. So for Black birth control reformers, their support was necessarily intersectional, in that birth control could be used as a tool to mitigate the impacts of a racist and exclusionary society. But ultimately, as I expand upon in the book, the reality was that separate birth control programming for African American communities further marginalized them, along with the other health inequities, such as would be perpetuated in medical education, training, funding, and development in all areas of human health. And it made their reproductive health a secondary cause. So we continue to feel the ramifications of these historical choices and trajectories in the US. We really struggle to define birth control and relatedly abortion as sound medical practice. Healthcare in minority communities continues to be marginalized, and African American maternal health is at a crisis point. Birth control funding and programming at the federal and state levels is at the whim of political agendas that continue to employ moral framings about race and class. And now there's the Dobbs decision, which has effectively struck down the legal right to abortion, but it also threatens birth control, as Justice Clarence Thomas suggested should be reevaluated in his concurrent opinion in Dobbs. He was referring, very briefly, to the Griswold v. Connecticut case. This is the case that legalized birth control for married couples in 1965. It's a case that the majority opinion in Roe would later draw upon for precedent. Griswold challenged one of the Little Comstock laws that banned contraception in Connecticut and established the right to marital privacy and to use birth control in consultation with their doctor. Notably, as the case wound its way up to the Supreme Court, the lower court was actually much more convinced by the rationale of doctor expertise than they were about the privacy argument. The court noted, is a doctor to be prosecuted as a criminal for doing something that is sound and right in the best tenets and traditions of a high calling dedicated and devoted to health? And Roe would follow that exact reasoning about doctor expertise. So when Norma McCorvey, who's pictured there on the left, Jane Roe, first sought to challenge the Texas abortion law in 1969, women's legal status in the United States was at best undefined, and there had been only sort of modest legal progress for women's rights past the 19th Amendment. Even as the feminist movement gained traction in the 1960s, women's rights within marriage, at work, and in the broader polity remained radically incomplete. So in an era where abortion and birth control could be outright dangerous, improved medical techniques were certainly welcomed by many, but the connection between medicine and morality also had significant consequences for many populations, including women and people of color. So it's this context that we have to remember informed the rationales of the 9 men who made up the court in 1973 and their decision about American women's right to abortion. And those 9 men were once again interested in returning professional rights to physicians to perform abortions if they saw fit. A century or so after physicians had led the campaign to criminalize abortion in order to professionalize, their subsequent involvement in the ensuing decades in the birth control movement would then shape new attitudes about abortion. By the middle of the 20th century, at doctors' urging, many states began to replace their older criminal abortion laws, giving wider latitude to medicalizing abortion. The law stated that legal abortions could only be performed in accredited hospitals. Patients had to apply to obtain an abortion, which would often be decided by a hospital staff abortion committee. In the wake of this law, hospitals imposed informal monthly quotas on abortions, and usually over half of these applications would be rejected for all the reasons that you might imagine, while the other half took so long that the applicants had already entered their second trimester by the time the decision was made. But it was that context that informed Blackmun's majority opinion. He wrote, "The decision vindicates the right of the physician to administer medical treatment according to his professional judgment." Indeed, Roe explicitly rejected a feminist framework, noting the appellant and some amici argue that the woman's right is absolute, that she is entitled to terminate her pregnancy at whatever time and whatever way, and for whatever reason she alone chooses. With this, we do not agree. Blackmun's refusal to entertain feminist rationales for abortion and his understanding of the meaning of privacy simply mirrored the larger context of this kind of mid-20th century America. In 1973, ideas about marital privacy and women's reproductive rights might have referenced feminism, but more often we're still wrapped in sort of this patriarchal cultural valence. Marital privacy for most American history meant the right of a husband who might or might not, depending on his temperament, allow his wife to make decisions on her own about her use of contraception, her health, her body, or her financial and employment matters. So in the era of Roe and Griswold, the idea that birth control or abortion belonged to the private sphere as a woman's decision was not inherent. In fact, it was only these cases that would forge the link more explicitly in the coming decades. Rather, the law recognized abortion and birth control as the domain of American medicine and the purview of physicians. It marked the high point of the cultural authority of medicine. Once again today, however, physicians find themselves again circumscribed by law in terms of their ability to practice obstetrical, gynecological, and reproductive medicine. So it's essential to keep in mind where we came from as we find out where we might go in a post-Roe world. Looking at the century-long trajectory helps us better understand how to carve new paths forward to best help patients and physicians. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. I'm taking the microphone so that we can run it for questions. We do have, is it on? Yeah. So we do have time for questions.
Thank you so much for that fascinating talk. I did have one question. So I'm not sure if you mentioned it, but I actually didn't hear much about condoms in this talk.
Yeah.
But I feel like that might be a bit ambiguous, and I'm thinking too about World War I and kind of this kind of spread of syphilis, gonorrhea. I'm wondering if there was like room for some sort of like medicalization in terms of preventing STIs, and why Sanger and some
Yeah.
others didn't kind of exploit that more.
Yeah,
Get
that's
rid
a
of that.
super, super great question. The condom industry is huge, but it was associated in the late 19th century with prostitution. And so a lot of like married women, respectable women didn't want to use condoms because that's what they argued their husbands used when they went with prostitutes. And so nevertheless, that of course, it didn't mean that condoms weren't sold on every corner and all of that. And then, as you point out, during World War I, there's this huge push by the US Public Health Service to make sure that soldiers are using condoms abroad. However, Sanger's and Dennett too, both of them really emphasized the idea that women should be in charge of contraceptives because condom relies on men's initiative. And so Sanger in particular was extremely dismissive of the idea that men would do the right thing and wear one. And so she argued that in many cases, abusive husbands might refuse to wear one, right? And wanted their wives to be pregnant, even if the wife did not want to. And so she argued that pessaries, diaphragms, spermicides, sponges, those things could be, especially douches, again, which are not effective, and yet that's what the vast majority of American women used in this period. She argued that that's something you can do without your husband knowing. So it's a great question. Absolutely.
I grew up in Baltimore. At that point, there was very well known, there was a physician that everybody knew who was performing abortions. In retrospect, clearly, he was performing abortions mostly for white folks with connection. I think there were similar people in Rochester.
Everywhere. Yeah.
What do we know about that phenomenon, how it was allowed, and how this took place?
Yeah, that's a great question also. So as I mentioned, the laws are enforced spottily, and sometimes in some states, they come down more harshly on physicians than in others. A lot of physicians are able to perform illegal abortions and escape or evade any kind of consequence, while others get publicly arrested. It becomes a big scandal. For example, I'm thinking about Chicago in the 1940s and 1950s, where in particular, for whatever reason, the Chicago police force was just very, very interested in cracking down on abortionists and really exploited the letter of the law, of the Illinois law, in ways that other states maybe not as much. And we also know that, for example, in the African-American community, a lot of the people who were performing abortions would not have been doctors, but just midwives and kind of women who kind of knew how to do it and knew who to go to. It was word of mouth. And so there is this phenomenon where people can obtain abortions, and they do. And yet the threat was that you never knew when the arm of the law was going to crack down on you. And that, I think, was the fear. It prevented a lot of physicians who probably otherwise would, OBGYNs who otherwise probably would have performed abortions, declined to do so because of fear of losing their medical license, very valid fears. And of course, those are the fears today. So you see a lot more kind of DIY. You see groups like Jane that were operating in Chicago, like these kind of women who decided to bypass. They're like, well, we're going to become the abortionists because there was this trope about the back alley butcher, right? And of course, that wasn't universal. There were many physicians who performed abortions safely and under the radar. But of course, illegal abortion also came with significant risk. Women died. So for every trope, there was also a kernel of truth. Yeah, it's very complicated though.
Well, I'll insert myself with a question.
Yeah.
I guess this is kind of a historian question. I also have history undergraduates in the room and graduate students. And so it's clear that the Supreme Court decision is based on that history.
Yeah.
And so, and the AHA president has kind of brought that up in a kind of very contested essay, has also said, there's a lot of things to talk about, but specifically, what do we do when there's bad history used to make policy?
Right.
And I can imagine, how you felt in May when this came out, and based on history that is wrong. I guess I'm not quite sure what the question is, but like, what do we do?
Yeah, what do we do?
What do we do? How do we defend
Yeah.
this narrative that anything goes and
Right.
that history is just a local tool to manipulate to get the results we want in court versus history is a rigorous discipline that requires,
Mhm.
So how do you, as an historian, grapple with so
Yeah.
much, false arguments being made in a public sphere and being passing policy? And I'm sure you have robust debates teaching in a state college in Georgia
Yes.
in your classroom. What is happening? What do we do with this?
Yeah, also a great question. It's so hard the answer is impossible, right? Because we do see history being wielded in the abortion debates as evidence. So the Dobbs opinion is one, but I'm also thinking about, for example, there are groups like the Susan B. Anthony Foundation and the Feminists for Life group that point to suffragist writings, and they argue that in the suffragist writings that there's a clear record of suffragists being pro-life. And of course, as a women's historian who's extensively studied the suffragist writings, that is just, it's an inaccurate reading, it's an incomplete reading, it's a reading that does not take into account, for example, the idea of voluntary motherhood, which was an animating idea in the women's movement in the 19th century, which argued that women have the right to control their own body, to choose when and where to have sex, and to how many children they should have. Most suffragists, even the most conservative, even women who were, head of the temperance movement, for example, were voluntary motherhood proponents. That was an ideal that crossed racial and class lines in the women's movement. So you had Black suffragists espousing that. You had white suffragists espousing that. And yet, so when they do write that abortion is a crime or it's immoral or murder or whatever, what they're talking about is that it's terrible that women have to do this because the patriarchy makes them. They basically blame men. They in fact, Matilda Joslyn Gage puts it like this: the crime of abortion lies at the door of the male sex. And so that is a very specific critique of abortion. That is not, and in fact, in many of the editorials that talk about that kind of thing, they go on to say that harsh laws do nothing but punish women. They do not solve the problem of the patriarchy. And so, that kind of misreading of history nevertheless has been wielded in op-eds, in public talks around the country. And so I think that people have there's a lot of misunderstanding about abortion history and what it I remember I had somebody say, well, isn't birth control a 20th century problem? I don't think people kind of understand just how far back this goes, that it's part of the human experience. And I think all of us who have been thinking about the bad history wielded as a weapon and Dobbs wielded as evidence to come to this conclusion that has basically stripped a right away from American women that has been in place since 1973 and returned it in many ways to something that looks like before Roe, but also not, like also worse, much worse, right? Yeah, because now like the laws don't have exceptions, not even for rape or incest. There's no therapeutic exceptions. That was not the case in the 19th century. And so this misreading of history and the refusal to kind of look at the broad context and to look at history in all of its like messy incompleteness is hurting American citizenship. The courts have basically thrust themselves into the role of like, we get to decide what happens. And many people have said, well, they're just returning the issue of abortion to the states where it can be voted on by the state legislature. So that's democracy. And it's like, Yes, but if you look at the legislatures that are passing strict abortion laws, they're male dominated, they're largely in the South and the West. It's basically making half the country anti-abortion. It's making women in half the country not full citizens, and while women elsewhere remain full citizens, right? And it's going to cause all kinds of issues with interstate commerce and travel across state lines and all of these things. And so the push to be able to understand history and all of its messy complexity, I mean, it extends to historians too. Like, we have to grapple with Margaret Sanger was a eugenicist. She said racist things. Whenever I talk about her, I get two kinds of questions. How dare you talk about Margaret Sanger not being a feminist? And then how dare you, not talk about how she was a eugenicist? And it's like, I'm talking about how she was both. She did all the things. She was a human being who she knew what she was saying and doing was wrong, because people of color told her it was wrong. They said, this is racist, this is eugenics, like, this is bad, you shouldn't do this. Dennett was telling her that. And yet she was a pragmatist and she did it anyway. Because she was so single-minded in her pursuit of legalizing birth control that she would do anything, and she would speak to any group that she thought might advance her cause. And that included women of the Ku Klux Klan. She gave a talk, it might have been somewhere in New York, I can't remember, at a KKK women's meeting. And she wrote about it afterwards. She said, I felt scared. I was like really scared to be there because, like, she acknowledged that she didn't necessarily want to be talking to them, but she was like, but the ultimate goal is what's important. I have to get the message out to everybody.
I'm wondering if in Dennett's vision of legislative change, if she did address the criticism about safety and platinums, did she want to be regulated much like there were laws regulating things?
Right. Yeah. So it's funny, she was also a little bit single-minded in her pursuit of, like, we just need to repeal birth control from the Comstock Act and then everything else will fall into place. Like, she addresses it. She says, oh, don't worry, that's going to come after. We will make sure that what is sold freely through these druggist catalogs or distributed by pharmacists or whatever, we're going to make sure that all of this is regulated and safe. But of course, this is like pre-FDA. So I think she wasn't thinking necessarily far enough ahead. For her, like, birth control was a civil liberty. She had these kind of ideals about how the Constitution should function in terms of citizenship. And that related to all the other things she was doing. She was a huge peace advocate. She was very anti-war. She spoke out against World War I. She joined like a very radical anti-war group, and she disapproved of, like, Sanger's law-breaking tactics. So for her to do that illustrates just the depth of how much she abhorred war, and she abhorred especially, in the 20s when they're cracking down on freedom of speech. This is the Red Scare, right? Palmer raids, all of these things. And she's watching all of that. And she kind of lumps birth control in with this, like, this whole ideal about sex and sexual freedom. And so her, kind of like Sanger, being like, okay, I just have this goal and I'm going to get to it no matter what. Like, it was like they were politicians and they had a message and they stuck to that message. So she does talk about it in her books and things about how, yes, eventually we're going to regulate contraception. But right now, that is not the problem. Right now, the problem is free distribution of information and making sure these doctors don't get to control it. So, yeah, good question.
So you told us we can take what we've learned from the real history and apply it to the future.
Yeah.
So
In theory.
can you give us a handle where we think what the history teaches about how we should go forward?
Yeah, I mean, I think what the biggest lesson that I see as a historian is that it is really crucial for medical students to understand this past history of contraception and abortion, so that they have, when you're getting your lectures about, techniques and things like that, you also have a cultural competence piece, right? Like, you have to understand where we came from in terms of the the relationship between race, gender, contraception, and abortion in order to be able to think about your training and kind of understand what your role is in going off into the world and then providing that care. And I think, we're in actually pretty good shape with the future of medical schools in many ways because of the diversity of applicants and entrants. Now the parity between men and women is where I think mostly where it should be in terms of how many women are graduating from medical school versus how many men and so forth. It's gone up and up every year. And so I think just awareness is the first step. And then, thinking through in medical societies and associations about how to alleviate inequity, how to attack this kind of like racist underpinning that formed American medicine in the past, but so many doctors and medical professionals today are seeking to, how do we fix that, right? And so it starts with conversations, and it starts with groups like the American Medical Association coming out strongly in favor of ideas and techniques and programming that will help accomplish that.
Right, I'm sure everyone here will join in thanking you for this really fascinating.
Thank
talk.
you.
It's great. I'm going to invite people to stay for a small reception we have over there, and maybe we can pepper you with some more questions and kind of think, how do we push back and what next? I also want to invite everybody in the room and on Zoom to join us next month when we're hosting Dr. Robert Ronowitz, who is a physician and historian of science, a professor, a former chair in the history and sociology of science at UPenn. He's a fabulous guy, really interesting thinker. He'll talk about entangled bodies, the challenges of creating so many medical interventions. So I'm sure it's going to be a fascinating talk. Thank you all for coming. Thank you. That was amazing.
Thank you so much for having me. I learned how to use the mouse. Oh, no.